Good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Eleni Foley of Barnard College, Columbia University. Professor Foley graduated from Swarthmore College, received an MAT in English and an MA in Classics from Yale University and a PhD in Classical Philology from Harvard University. She has served as president of the American Philological Association in 1998 and was a professor of classics at Berkeley in spring 2008. Professor Foley is a leading figure in the study of women in antiquity and an expert in many aspects of Greek tragedy, including its reception and performance. She is the author of Ritual Irony, Poetry and Sacrifice in Euripides, Cornell University Press, 1985, The Homeric Hymn to Demeter, Princeton University Press, 1994, Female Acts in Greek Tragedy, which is actually her Martin Classical Lectures, Princeton University Press, 2001, and Reimagining Greek Tragedy on the American Stage, University of California Press, 2012, which is her Southern Classical Lectures. Professor Foley is co-author of Women in the Classical World, Images and Text, Oxford, 1994, editor of Reflections of Women in Antiquity, and co-editor of Visualizing the Tragic, Oxford University Press, 2007, and of Antigone on the Contemporary World Stage, also Oxford University Press, 2011. She is currently finishing a book on Euripides' Hecuba and working on tragic choruses. Today, Professor Foley will give a talk titled Reconsidering the Performance of Choral Odes in Greek Tragedy. Professor Foley, please.
First of all, I just wanted to thank the entire group for inviting me here. This is my first trip in Israel, and I'm really excited to be here and to be able to share this work in progress with you. So thank you. This may be a little difficult because I'm going to be trying to juggle my handout with my talk. And the reason that there's such a detailed handout is that I'm really going to be making fairly small points about a large number of passages. And you can look at them in much more detail afterwards. But I have little marks in the places where you're supposed to really pay attention now. So don't be overwhelmed by the handout because actually it will go by quite quickly. Okay, so just to remind those who haven't been working on Greek tragedy recently, choral odes in Greek tragedy and old comedy typically included matching strophes and antistrophes, that is, turns and counter-turns in the dance. You probably all know this. Each unique strophic pair shared the same meter, which we can more or less reconstruct, and very probably the same music. That although we know at least something about ancient Greek music, our musical fragments only include a few from Greek tragedy. We know very little about the performance of tragic dance, and whether strophes and antistrophes shared the same choreography cannot, I think, be demonstrated, given lack of evidence. In a chapter of his book, Tragedy in Athens, entitled The Mimetic Action of the Chorus, however, David Wiles bravely argued that by examining the relation between choral strophes and antistrophes in tragic odes, he can reconstruct a possible connection between them whose meaning would have been enhanced by identical dance movements, even in apparently resistant cases. And by resistant cases, you'll see what I mean is pairs where there isn't any verbal evidence that we can really make an obvious connection that could be related to dance. Wilde's arguments about possible choreography are, in my view, entirely speculative. Yet the questions that his provocative chapter raises continue, in my view, to be worth thinking about further. Identifying possible specific connections between strophe and antistrophe that could invite being performed, even if we cannot reconstruct ancient dance figures specifically, is important because it can, in my view, enrich our attempt to reconstruct the meaning of the odes, which clearly depended so strongly in the original context on performance. This paper is very much a work in process that explores how we might go about making some progress on the question of how dance might have underlined or enriched meaning in the choral odes of Greek tragedy, mostly. There'll be one comic passage. I'm going to begin by examining strophic pairs that are marked by, and now you should turn to handout page 1, number 1. Passages that are marked, by a repeated, sometimes mimetic image that I think invites shared choreography that could significantly enhance choral meaning. So my first example, handout 1. For example, both the first strophe and antistrophe of Aeschylus's Agamemnon end with a reference to the image of two eagles feasting on a pregnant hare, followed by the same final refrain, Ailion ailion epe, todeo nikato. Okay, and you can look at that in more detail later, but I can assure you that the eagles and the pregnant hare are there in both cases. Plutarch's Table Talk, which I will discuss in more detail shortly, suggests that choral schemata, meaning dance figures or poses, could include representational positions to which dance movements, he calls forae, led, and with which they concluded, as they seem plausibly to have done, I'm arguing, in this particular case. As Plutarch puts it, in culminating representational positions or pauses that he calls schemata, dancers, now I'm quoting Plutarch, dancers compose their body in the attitude of Apollo or Pan or a Bacchant, and then retain that aspect like figures in a picture, end quote. The verbal and metrical echo at the conclusion of this strophic pair that you just looked at, I think, is pretty obvious. We have the same image and the same refrain. But if this echo were performed choreographically, and in some sense mimetically, the whole choral ode would have pointedly established from the first sung moment a visual focus on an image representative of a terrible sacrifice of innocence that anticipates the horrific sacrifice of Iphigenia that enabled the Greeks' voyage to Troy, to which this very, very long choral parados, or opening choral ode, actually leads. Okay, and you'll notice the word thuomanoisin emphasizing the sacrificial motif in line 136. Similarly, the second strophe and antistrophe of the first stasimone, by which I mean act dividing ode, of Agamemnon, this is handout number 2, are linked by an image at lines 407 to 8 and 424 to 6 of a figure that eludes the grasp of those who desire it. And I underline there this particular figure with the verbal similarities between the two parts, as well as the image babake and babaken being repeated. So you see that there's a verbal matching as well as an image matching going on there. In the strophe, this elusive figure is embodied in Helen. Helen's departure for Troy leaves destruction behind, both destruction for the Greek armies pursuing her and destruction instead of a dowry, Antiphronon Ilioi Thoron in 406, that she brought to Troy. Helen haunts the house of Menelaus in this strophe with its phasma or phantom, line 415, that rules the house through the desire for the one beyond the sea and through its eyeless statues that lack erotic charm or charis. And again, you can read this more later if you want to just see how it's all put together. This image of Helen is exactly matched in the antistrophe by dream images producing mourning that bring empty delight. Karin Matayan in 422, which is another oxymoronic phrase. But the image of elusive figures shared by the strophic pair then expands in the antistrophe to haunt not just the house of Menelaus, as in the strophe, but the larger group of houses pervaded by sorrow at receiving funerary urns and ashes instead of the men that have died in the Trojan War. Here, the repeated image of a figure who escapes the grasp that leads to loss, paralysis, anger, or revenge, although in this case it occurs earlier than the concluding point of the strophic pair, as in my first example, could be embodied in a dance figure that serves as a powerfully visualized transition point and link between sorrows pervading the royal house and those of the city that occurs, as Judith Fletcher has shown in a lengthy article, in the ode as a whole. That also moves, that is the whole ode, moves from house to city. In sum, if marked by dance, this elusive, destructive, and pivotal figure that eludes the grasp could serve to unify the structure of the stasimone as a whole in performance. Now, if you could turn to passage 3. For an equally marked, repeated image at the start of a strophic pair, we could turn to the closing strophic pair of the stasimone in Aeschylus' Libation Bearers that enumerates monstrous mythological figures, and especially monstrous women, like Clytemnestra, who have violently perverted Greek royal households. Both the strophe and the antistrophe, and this is the last one in the ode, begin with a reference to a sword that perverts justice or decay in the strophe and will be wielded to restore justice by implication through Orestes' vengeance for his father, Agamemnon, in the antistrophe. And in this case, and it may not be relevant given our evidence on ancient dance, it is interesting that Hesychius tells us, when he's talking about existing dance figures, that there was a figure called the xiphismos, or sword figure, and we know what happened in it, which is that the dancers raised their arms straight into the air. So possibly we have a ready-made figure for this particular moment. This stasimone marks the transition in the play between the scene at the tomb of Agamemnon, where Orestes and Electra are reunited and call on their father's ghost to support their revenge, and Orestes' return to the palace in disguise in order to try to carry out his revenge on Aegisthus and Clytemnestra. The image of the sword of justice vividly links past and future violence, but also marks a shift or reversal from past injustice to future, if ambiguous, justice. Orestes' wielding of his sword at the breast of Clytemnestra serves as the climax of this act of revenge in the very next scene. If, as ancient sources suggest, the chorus in tragedy did reverse direction from strophe to antistrophe, with a move to the right followed by a move to the left, reversal in movement could also, as in this case, not only expand on the movement of repetitions in dance, but underscore or qualify such a partial reversal in meaning from injustice to justice. And I can't give you lots of examples, but I have many examples now where that reversal seems to play a very critical role. Before discussing additional strophic pairs from other tragic odes, however, let us take a brief step backwards to consider more broadly some of the limits of our knowledge on dramatic choreography. Wiles's chapter specifically reacts to the arguments of the noted scholar of Greek metrics, A.M. Dale. Dale agrees that it seems intuitively likely that the choral strophes and antistrophes could be danced with the same movements, given the examples of strophic pairs where a possible mimetic relation is visible in the language itself. And now if you could turn to passage 4, and this is Dale's example of her point. In Euripides' Ion 184 to 203, for example, where the chorus of Attic slave women are raptly observing, in their imagination, I think not on stage, the sculptures on the temple of Apollo at Delphi. The strophe closes with the chorus inviting the audience to see Heracles' slaying of the Hydra, and the antistrophe with an identical invitation to observe Bellerophon's slaying of the Chimera astride Pegasus. This strophic pair could have concluded with a shared figure, similar to that I'm arguing exists possibly for the sacrifice of the hare by the eagles that closed the first strophic pair of the Agamemnon parados, as well as sharing some kind of pointing gesture. If you look at the passage, you see that the chorus is inviting people to look at these sculptures that they're imagining seeing on the temple. Once again, this opening image of the parados also visibly establishes for the play as a whole, if it is marked by a dance figure, a central thematic tension between heroes supported by Olympian gods and chthonic earthborn monsters. Nevertheless, for Dale, a number of examples, such as the very next strophic pair and the Ion parados, which I didn't put on the handout, in which the antistrophe of this ode remarkably breaks into a dialogue between the chorus and the young temple servant Ion, or Euripides' Bacchae 977 to 1023, which I didn't put on the handout. It's one of Dale's negative examples for Wiles's ideas, simply because I don't have enough to say about it. Such passages make it very difficult to reconstruct how the same dance movements could link strophe and antistrophe. In Euripides' Bacchae 977 following, Dale points out that, quote, the strophe is a hounding on of the Bacchic Thyasos in the mountains against a spy, that's Pentheus, in woman's dress, whose discovery is dramatically reimagined, while the antistrophe is reflective in tone, end quote. Wiles argues against Dale here in response that, quote, there is no way that an audience could grasp the intended symmetry in the strophic pair with its identical concluding refrain without the medium of dance, which generalizes the concrete narrative of the strophe and concretizes the abstract language of the antistrophe in order to draw action and thought together, end quote. The Dochmiac meter shared by this strophic pair, this problematic one that Dale is skeptical about, also suggests an undercurrent of high emotion and tension beneath an apparent thematic contrast. For those who don't know, Dochmiac meter is a very excited meter that's specific to tragedy, so it's raising the intensity at this point, even in a reflective passage. So here it seems to me that Wiles makes an important general point in principle, even if I'm not going to agree with specific details of his attempt to suggest possible dance movement that could bring strophe and antistrophe together in performance, since there are no obvious repeated verbal clues or shared images of the kind that I'm trying to call attention to earlier, that I've been trying to call attention to earlier to build on. Tragic poets themselves developed the choreography for these odes, along with the poetry and music, and presumably would have aimed to create an effective relation between word, music, meter, and dance movement that made the meaning of a strophic pair for the spectator more concrete in performance. In fact, strophic pairs in tragedy outside this problematic Bacchae 977 following noted by Dale similarly juxtapose a more concrete mimetic strophe with an antistrophe whose language is more generalizing and abstract. It happens really quite often, and I'm now going to look at a different Bacchae passage that I think I have a little more to say about. As a play, Bacchae centers on a pattern of divine justice that moves inexorably towards its goal over time through a sometimes frenetic enactment of that goal by people gripped by Dionysic madness or joy, or inspired by traditional wisdom about divine justice. Dionysus's liberating gifts, and now if you could turn to passage 5, please. Dionysus's liberating gifts that make him epiotatos, the kindness of gods to mortals, are repeatedly linked throughout the play with an avenging Dionysus who, when rejected, is denotatos, the most terrible of gods, as in line 861, just before this ode. Denotatos anthroposi epiotatos. Bacchae 862 through 901, which in my view suggestively follows the just quoted emblematic line 861, like the seemingly more opaque Stasimone at 977 following, pairs a concrete strophe that evokes Dionysiac dance with a more abstract antistrophe. The strophe represents a faun dashing to escape hunters in the wilds, and the antistrophe contemplates the slow and inexorable working of divine justice. Here, a rushing movement suggestive of release, provided by references to Maenadic-style dance in the strophe, is apparently paired with a slow and initially invisible divine movement in the antistrophe, which hunts down the unholy and eventuates in the release provided by belief. An identical refrain, which I've marked with an X, which includes the mimetic image of a hand held over the heads of enemies, perhaps the basis for a dance schema, closes and bonds each part of the strophic pair. Choreography could set up in some fashion the shared motif of hunting eventuating in release, despite the shift of focus from hunted to hunter. Yet, as in Bacchae 977 following, the difficult passage not on your handout, the apparent change in tone from mimetic to abstract and from rushed to measured remains marked, if possibly performable, in the relation between strophe and antistrophe, unless reversal in tempo could pointedly accompany the perhaps standard reversal in direction between strophe and antistrophe. The odes of Bacchae, which offer constant reference to movement and music associated with Dionysiac ritual, makes the mystery of the unity of the beneficent and terrible epiotatos and denotatos, and the liberating and avenging sides of the gods, constantly visible through language and meter. I've argued elsewhere that overall, Bacchae pointedly makes the case for accepting the beneficent and terrible Dionysus into the city of Thebes, and for recognizing his divinity through choral performance itself. Given the shape of the whole play, then, I think Wells is right, even if I doubt the details of his specific analysis of possible choreography for the later Stasimone at 977 following, that choral dance, as well as music and meter, would probably have linked different and opposing aspects of the god through the bodies of the chorus, even though the words alone can make it very difficult in passages like 977 following and in many other cases to envision how the span might have worked in the choreography. Moreover, the identical refrains that occur in both of these Bacchae odes seem to make this argument more likely. Although Deo convincingly raises questions about how dance could link abstractions with mimetic images in such strophic pairs, I think choreography, and now if you could turn to passage 6, please. I think choreography, even mimetic movement, could have served to link and enhance more abstract ideas visualized in strophic pairs. For example, in the first strophe and antistrophe of the so-called Hymn to Zeus, back in the Parados of Agamemnon again, lines 165 to 174 embed a series of 5 dactyls in a series of metrical leucothea. In other words, the whole strophe is this meter leucotheon, which I'm not going to go into because I want to focus on those dactyls that suddenly pop up in the middle there. William Scott and Charles Skiason have argued that the iambotrochaic leucotheon becomes associated with Zeus's justice throughout the whole Orestean trilogy. Each single, more metrically liberating dactylic line in this strophic pair refers to Zeus at its opening, plain Dios in strophe and Sena in the antistrophe. Although line 165 refers to throwing off a mental burden through Zeus, and 174 to performing a victory ode for Zeus that will hit a target, the same choreographical gesture, a concluding figure perhaps hinted at in the word balein, or throw, in 166, could profoundly underline the climactic solution to a choral struggle involving comparison and weighing of choices about understanding Zeus's divinity central to the strophic pair as a whole. Moreover, and now if you could turn to passage 6a, which is later in the Agamemnon, the anapestic lines that open the second stasimon of Agamemnon could re-evoke an image that links targeting and aiming in relation to Zeus through its references to Zeus Xenios turning his bow on Alexander, that is Paris, so that it is neither too high or too low. That's 362 to 66 is the Anapes. The beginning of the certainly dance first strophe, that comes right after, that immediately follows these recitative anapests, seems to echo and affirm the possibility that the chorus could visually answer its own earlier query about Zeus's justice through a gesture that the fall of Troy brings to realization. Quote, they can speak of the blow struck by Zeus that can readily be traced to its source. He did as he ordained, end quote. In this case, a marked earlier dance image could be repeated and reinterpreted to underline the question of divine justice central to the whole trilogy later in the play, in the same way that the meter of the Leucotheon does a similar thing on the musical level. Wiles's chapter confronts some of the most difficult choral passages for his case. I have so far been proposing instead to explore these questions through passages where images, sounds, words, and meter can offer more obvious clues, not about specific choreography, but about points where the enactment of links between strophic pairs through dance movement could have enhanced the meaning of the ode. By way of background, despite hopelessly limited evidence, a number of sources suggest that Greek dance could often be mimetic in a wide and not necessarily literal range of ways. Aristotle's Poetics, for example, says that the employment of dance rhythms embodied in gesture imitates ethe, or character, pathe, or emotions, and praxes, actions. There's a hard to figure out exactly what that would mean and necessarily in terms of dance movements. More generally, Plutarch's Table Talk begins with a discussion of boys performing the Pyrrhic dance, a form of dance that was already familiar in classical Athens, and that very possibly, that is this passage, refers more generally to dance movement practiced in classical drama, rather than pantomime alone, as in many later Greek sources on dance. Plutarch develops an argument by a so-called Ammonius, who was at the time head of Plato's Academy, about the superiority of dance practices in the distant past to contemporary ones because they linked word and movement. So I think Plutarch is talking about earlier dance, not just pantomime here. As noted earlier, he states with frustrating lack of specificity that choral dance included movements he calls forai, which maybe means something like phrases, that culminate in representational positions, poses, or pauses that he calls schemata, quote, and then I'm repeating this passage, in which dancers compose their bodies in the attitude of Apollo or Pan or Bacchant, and then retain that aspect like figures in a picture, end quote. Many anecdotes about earlier tragedians, including Aeschylus, emphasize their inventive use of multiple and sometimes mimetic dance schemata. We have lots of those choices, and that's clearly the word for dance figure, I think. Nevertheless, the term schema may also have been used, as Greek dance historian Lillian Lawler has argued more generally, to describe dance gestures, figures, poses, or movements. The third central element in dance identified by Plutarch in Table Talk is deixis. And what he seems to mean by deixis here is a non-mimetic pointing out or drawing attention to an object within real or imaginary sight. A gesture parallel, in his view, to naming in the language of poetry, and not necessarily limited to describing a dance figure. Plutarch says that, quote, that whereas, quote, poets employ onomatopoeia and metaphor in their pursuit of imitative representation and vivid suggestion, the dance schema is mimetikon, imitative of a morphe or idea, something like a shape or a visual image, which the fora, maybe phrase, quote, is expressive of some pathos, now he's together with Aristotle here, emotion, or praxis, action, together with Aristotle there, or dunamis, some kind of potentiality of some kind. None of our evidence, including this, the cryptic list of dance schemata named in Pollux and references in other sources like Lucian, can give us a repertory of specific movement or establish a way in which the probably more restrained choral dance in tragedy differed from that in comedy, satyr play, solo dance, or other non-dramatic choral dance. Nevertheless, the passages that I've already cited make it seem plausible, I hope, that repeated schemata, such as we may have seen in Agamemnon, or libation bearers or Ion, could in some cases link strophic pairs. The Ion passage, since it also asks the spectators to look at the sculptures that the chorus claims to be observing, would, as would probably or even exclusively rely on deictic gestures as well, Plutarch's third mode that deixis. Nevertheless, I'm also proposing that a dance schema of the kind described by Plutarch may well have occurred at the conclusion or beginning of a strophic pair, as in the Agamemnon passage number 1, okay, and libation bearers, as in passage number 3, or at another point in a strophic pair, as in passage 2, where the central gesture in this last case might better be described as representing or including what Plutarch called a phora, since it involves an action still in some way pictorial, or what we might call a sort of rhythmic transfer rather than holding of a pose. Tragedy, however, along with its odes, is rarely meta-theatrical. So a written text generally fails to provide us with direct references to specific dance movements that we can find in Greek lyric or comedy or satyr play upon occasion. Comedy or satyr play, by contrast to tragedy, can refer to specific choral dance movements, even if we often cannot be sure of exactly what they entailed. And now we have a long passage, 7 to 7a, where I'm giving you the English first and the Greek second. You can look at it in more detail because there's a lot of references to movement, and I'm only going to talk about some aspects of this. So, to give one example from comedy, the female chorus of Aristophanes' Thesmophoria Zeusi takes their position for one dance by saying, and now I'm reading the translation, but you can look at the Greek if you want. All right now, let's do a cheerful dance, as is women's custom here, when in holy season we celebrate our solemn mysteries for the twain goddesses, that's Demeter and Persephone. They then go on to say, quote, let's start our number, go light on your feet, form up a circle, and join your hands. Everyone mark the beat of the dance. Step out with an agile foot. Our choreography should allow us to turn an eye in every direction. In other words, they're proposing to perform a circular dance movement here. And if you could just fast forward in the handout to image 9, so you can visualize in your head if this vase actually does refer to men performing in female roles as a tragic chorus in the top register of this vase. You see them moving around not in a rectangular formation, but in a line or perhaps in a circle. And you can see with these figures how it would enable you to be looking in many directions if you were moving in a circle, as opposed to if you were in a rectangular formation, which tragic choruses in my next visual example will be doing, okay, where you have to be looking out at the audience as opposed to each other. You can sort of visualize that way. I continue with this passage. So here, the chorus describes their own circle dance, traditional to honoring Demeter and Persephone during the ritual of the Thesmophoria, and then go on to honor the Olympian gods in the rest of the passage. They refer pointedly, if you look at the whole passage, to their rhythm, to the movement of their hands and feet, their exchange of glances, and later to points where they halt their steps, and then they shift into double time, to leaps and whirling motions. And you can look at this passage at greater length later and see that all these things happen. The circular dance probably deliberately represents, and now if you could turn to passage 8, and you can go back to 7 later if you want. Give you a second to get there. Okay, so the circular dance probably represents a pointed shift in tone and choreography from the chorus's only earlier strophic pair at Thesmophoria Zeusi 433 following. This earlier strophic pair first praised a female speaker whom the chorus had just heard castigating Euripides for his misogyny, and then castigated the speech of Euripides' disguised relative who had revealed damaging secrets about women. In this later ode, the chorus now refuses to castigate men at 964 to 66. That's back to passage 7. 7A, and turns to traditional female religious performance in a circle dance. I would suggest that the earlier choruses in this play, which initially involved imitating male processions and assemblies, could possibly have used rectangular formations that would certainly be used by dramatic choruses playing male roles like soldiers, as in the visual image 10. In the visual image 10, in this formation, a reversal from right to left to right could once again underline the shift from praise to blame in the earlier strophe and antistrophe at 433 following of Thesmophoria Zusi. We can visualize such possible movement in the Basel red figure column crater dated around 490 BCE, which depicts a half chorus of 6 soldiers in rectangular formation using deictic gestures who seem to be gazing towards a figure who is probably emerging from a tomb at the left. Here, the soldiers look to the side and appear in profile, whereas in a circular dance, as in the visual image 9, if that's what it is, a choral dance, the chorus members look at each other and focus on their own community. As the chorus say, our choreography should allow us to turn an eye in every direction, towards the audience and each other. If so, the new circle dance at Thesmophoria Zusi 955 following would underline a movement towards reconciliation between the genders in the play as a whole through a return to gender-appropriate ritual dance movement. That is the circular movement they're doing in 954 following. That is circular as opposed to a perhaps more masculine or gender-neutral rectangular formation. In tragedy, the closest we can come to this kind of self-referential description of choral dance occurs quite regularly in scenes of lament. And now if you could turn to passage 11. Where a chorus can refer to stage beating of breasts and tearing of cheeks, which they're almost certainly imitating. For example, in handout 11, immediately following a choral lament in Euripides' Suppliants by the mothers of the 7 against Thebes for their dead sons, in which they refer to such funereal gestures, Theseus enters and at 87 to 89 refers to the very actions that the chorus seems to have been just performing. Quote, whose is the wailing, the beating of breasts, the keening for the dead I've just heard? It's as if it's a comment on what he's actually seen them perform. If we needed confirmation, this remark confirms that the chorus has been enacting lamenting gestures during their ode. And if I had time, I could take you through virtually all of the Persians where you would be seeing this happening in strophes and antistrophes through the whole thing with lamenting gestures. Similarly, during the second parados, and now if you could turn to passage 12, or binding song of the Erinyes in Aeschylus' Eumenides, the chorus of Furies first announces their formation as a chorus. This is lines 307 to 09. This part is not on the handout. So they say, quote, come, let us form a chorus, since it's time to make our beautiful music visible. So they apparently haven't been in choral formation. They're now moving into a choral formation and describing what they're doing. Then, as Jopi Prince has shown, quote, they begin to sing stage directions for their own dance, end quote, and their words become actions. At Eumenides 368 to 76, that is handout 12, strophe gamma ends with a suggested reference by the chorus to, quote, black-garbed assaults and the angry dancing of our feet, end quote. The Euphymnion that immediately follows, that's 372 to 76, seems very likely to describe and perform this angry dance movement to which their song referred. Quote, For I give a great leap, and then bring down my foot from above with a heavy crash, a leg to trip even a runner at full stretch, and cause unendurable ruin. I'm suggesting that this is performed as it's described in their words. The beginning of antistrophe gamma then immediately refers to this possible just performed felling of a guilty man, underlining the point verbally, if I'm right. Nevertheless, the choruses in tragic odes, as Albert Henricks has argued, can refer to themselves as choruses, and thus invite a connection for the audience between their role in the plays and in the theater itself. These moments of what Henricks calls choral self-referentiality or choral projection occasionally offer hints about choral movement. An example of choral projection that comes close to demonstrating an exact choreographical correspondence between a strophe and antistrophe through a specific textual reference to dance movement, although it's a little indirect, occurs in passage 13, Antigone 11:37 to 52. Here, the chorus is asking Dionysus to come to Thebes with a catharsioi podi, or purifying foot, to liberate the city from woe in the strophe. In the antistrophe, the chorus again refers to Dionysus as choragos, or chorus leader of the stars, and asks him to come with his thyiads to dance all night in honor of Aeacus. The cleansing movement of the arriving god's foot is suggestive of the Bacchic dance that is echoed in the antistrophe, because Dionysus traditionally arrives in cities in the form of dance, and because both verbal and visual references to Maenadic dance typically include raising feet, often in kicks and leaps. Here, the language of the odes comes about as close as possible in tragedy to inviting a specific dance movement that conveys virtually the same meaning in the words and meter of both strophe and antistrophe. Nevertheless, this kind of precise parallel reference to choral dance in both parts of the strophic pair in Antigone is not only rare, but atypical in the sense that even fairly similar passages invite a more complex interpretation of what might have been involved in eliciting response to a shared figure or movement in the case of a choral projection. So now I'm going to turn to some much more difficult questions in my last passage that I'm going to discuss with you here. So we're going to turn to passage 14 here. At lines 1058 to 81 of Sophocles' Antigone, Electra, these lines take place after her sister Chrysothemis has refused to help Electra take revenge on Aegisthus for killing their father Agamemnon, since the sisters falsely believe that Orestes is dead. Electra remains determined to pursue her revenge plan. And I'm actually going to read a translation of the strophic and antistrophe pair so you can see something complicated, more complicated, that I want to show here, maybe. So, the strophe goes in English: when we see birds, emphasis on birds here, above, that are so wise, taking care to sustain those that give them life and pleasure, do we not render the same services? But by Zeus's lightning and divine justice in the sky, trouble shall soon follow. O voice that for mortals travels below the earth, cry out a sad message to the Atridae below, carrying a joyless message of dishonor. And now the antistrophe. Tell them that their house suffers from a plague, and that the strife between their children is no longer leveled out in loving life together. But the daughter is betrayed and alone tosses on the sea, ever lamenting her father's fate and sorrow, like the ever-grieving nightingale, underlined, reckless of death and ready to renounce the light, if she can bring down the twin Erinyes. Who could be so loyal to her father? Okay, we'll come back to the next strophic pair in a minute. Okay. In response to this division between the sisters, the choral strophe begins by asking why humans do not follow birds in caring for those who gave them life and pleasure. But by Zeus's lightning and Themis, such presumably unfilial people, they assert, will soon suffer. The chorus then asks a phonic voice to cry out a pitiful message of dishonor to the Atridae below that cannot be danced. The antistrophe then addresses those below, okay, deictically speaking in both cases, about the strife between the two children in a sick household. Agamemnon's daughter is left lamenting and groaning for her father like the ever-greeting nightingale, another bird, ready to die to bring down the two Erinyes. Who could be so devoted to her father, they ask. Once again, the antistrophe both echoes and critically reverses the strophe. Both begin with humans disrupting natural bonds in a family that are by contrast respected by birds in the natural world. The optimistic assertion concerning divine justice in the strophe responds to Electra's beleaguered determination to act in the antistrophe. And remember, practice and character can be part of what's expressed in dance movement. The unmusical cry to the Atridae at the bottom of the strophe in the world below to undo injustice is met with the lament of Electra in the antistrophe. And lament is often described as unmusical in tragedy. The last line of the antistrophe, which echoes the opening question of the strophe about familial disunion by answering it with another question, reasserts Electra as a paradigmatic example of the devotion to father that was threatened in the bird image at the opening. Here the song seems to have gone full circle, as the opening image of the filial birds responds to that of the heroine represented as a nightingale at the end of the antistrophe. So I'm asking, because I've only shown you things where there are parallel matches up to now, could a deictic gesture to those below link the end of the strophe to the beginning of the antistrophe? If so, matching movements could perhaps be underlined by dance moves and sound in various ways in the case of different choral stasima. In other words, the match might come at the beginning, the end of one, beginning of the next, or the beginning of the whole thing, the end of the strophe, and not be exactly the same dance movement, exactly, in a parallel sense. So if you turn now to the last page of the handout, and again, I will read this passage. It's the strophe and antistrophe that just immediately follow this in the Select Ode. No one who is noble consents to sully his fame by a miserable life without glory. My child, O Pi Pi. Thus have you chosen a glorious life bathed in tears, giving a weapon to a noble remedy, so that you win on one score twofold praise, being called a daughter wise and noble. And then the antistrophe says, may you, again deictically indicating Electra who's there on stage, may you live as much above your enemies in strength and wealth as now you are below them. For I have found you enjoying no happy fate, yet winning the highest prize in the observance of the greatest laws by your piety towards Zeus. So this the second brief strophic pair in this stasimone echoes and consolidates the concluding theme of filial piety. Both open with a deictic address to Electra. The chorus offer her a general observation about noble mortals unwilling to sully their alclea with an inglorious life that is matched by a hope that Electra will surpass her enemies in glory and wealth. Electra's choice for a life of lament is a glorious weapon that ensures twofold praise in the strophe, and her unhappy life wins the highest praise through her observance of Megista Nomina, or greatest laws, and by her piety to Zeus in the antistrophe. Here, the symmetrical parallels between strophe and antistrophe, especially marked by an opening, presumably deictic address to Electra, are of the kind that I've been talking about earlier. In the play as a whole, the chorus of Sophocles' Electra begin by offering resistance to the aggressively lamenting heroine, but soon give her cause their full support for the remainder of the play. At this point in the action, the chorus must have very slim hopes that Electra can carry out her plans for revenge all by herself. Yet they respond to this slim hope and to the unfortunate familial division between the sisters that have occurred just before this ode by praising the rejected Electra as a paradigm of filial devotion, despite her unnatural quarrel with her sister, emphasized in Chrysothemis' line just before the ode. Electra's plan is short-lived. Orestes, though not yet recognized, arrives, as you can see from the end of the ode, arrives at the conclusion of the Stasimone and will eventually bond with Electra. Yet the chorus's transformation of a paradigm of unnatural familial disruption by Chrysothemis and Electra, just performed before the ode on stage, into an example of natural familial piety, perhaps crystallized in the image of a filial bird, arguably sets the stage for the series of dramatic reversals and victories that happen later through its performance. And on the other hand, the ode also celebrates Electra, even if Orestes then comes in to play the central role in the revenge. The audience is asked to experience this transformation or reversal concretely through shifts in the corresponding elements of the strophic pairs. Moreover, the highly parallel structure of the second strophic pair strongly asserts this transformation by physically directing its song to Electra. So, in conclusion, I hope there haven't been too many passages here. I agree with David Wiles that choral dance could serve as a critical bonding element between strophic pairs, but I remain uncertain about whether exactly repeated dance movement would make sense in all cases, if I'm at all correct about what we saw in the first strophic pair of the passage from Sophocles' Electra. And I could give you more examples, but I won't. We can't help but give primacy to word or meter, presumably underscored by music, in our study of choral strophes and antistrophes. But we shouldn't allow our lack of evidence about performance and exact dance movements to over-determine our interpretation of the odes on this basis alone, I'm arguing at least. The language of the odes, whether strophe and antistrophe are marked by shared images or strong repeated references to gesture or possible dance movement, does seem to invite realization through choreography with telling specificity in at least some cases. Moreover, we may be able to make conjectures, at least in a limited number of cases, about the effect and meaning of choral dance in performance that isn't based on identifying any specific dance figures, or so I'm arguing. Just moments that invite a figure. At the very least, then, our text of Greek tragedy might better reflect their meaning by allowing readers to experience strophes and antistrophes of each ode juxtaposed visually, as I'm trying to do on this handout. So, thank you.
I will never read a strophe and antistrophe the same way again. Thank you very much. As I listen to your talk, various cases passed through my mind. First of all, cases from modern cases. This is a striking a pose. I immediately thought of two examples of that. One in HMS Pinafore. A British tar is a soaring skull, so his fist should etc. And at the end of it, there is the stage. The stage direction, but there's a pose. They all stand in the way that they describe. And the other one is in West Side Story, at the end of, with a line I will not quote directly, at the end of the song, Dear Officer Krupke, when they all get together at the end, they strike a pose, making an obscene gesture to the police officer who they're imagining.
Yeah, well, I think almost everybody agrees that dance figures were mimetic in part, but I think it's complicated because I do think Plutarch's really talking about something, and I think he's talking about something more than just a mimetic figure, and that it can involve transitional.
Well, what I was going to say was that your talk would perhaps change slightly. If I were writing a commentary on a classical tragedy, your talk would now change the way I would write it somewhat. But if I were producing a classical tragedy, your talk would change from beginning to end, the way everything I would do with the choral, because there are many, many different things you can do with comparing, running it faster, running it slower, running it, and most of those will be dependent upon the imagination of course, in this case, it will originally have been the imagination of the tragedian himself, who was after the Didaskalos. He was the one who he had in mind also how these things were supposed to be done. Nowadays, it would be the imagination of the director.
Right. Well, I think one of the reasons I got interested in this topic is because I have a lifelong experience in performing or supervising the performance of Greek and Roman plays in the original languages, which we do at Barnard and Columbia every year. And so with working with the choreographers and the directors, trying to figure out what there is to use in the relation between strophes and antistrophes, even if they're not going to be literal about it, I started thinking about this whole topic more and more.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. And I also wanted to ask you about perhaps another innovation that is raised by the talk, and has to do with the visual presentation here, and specifically with the Pandora figure. Would you think that perhaps we could look at it as a presentation of a satire play based on the loss from Pandora, like that it is a kind of representation of the choral dance?
Well, that's a really good question. If we only had the Sophocles play, it would be nice. The one place that I really have been able to find in Seder play where the chorus specifically refers to dance movement in a way that's very similar to what I've been talking about here is actually in the fragments of the Eknutai of Sophocles. And there's a moment where the chorus is very specifically describing its movement and what it's doing in exactly the right places. The Cyclops has frustrated me because the choral odes there are very short and they're very broken up in various ways, and it's really hard to see exactly how the dance movement would be working, except that it was very frenetic and had dance moves that we actually probably do know something about, because we have enough vases that actually show people in Seder costume doing certain movements like this and other things that almost certainly actually were probably used in Seder play choreography. And that might also be true. I mean, if I had more time to talk about it, I think that's one thing that's very useful about thinking more about the Bacchae, which I'm working on doing, simply because we do know quite a lot about what Maenadic dance figures actually look like, again, from vases. So we have certain certain visual ideas to work with, even if there wasn't a literal imitation of them, which isn't true really of a lot of other choral dance in tragedy.
I think you've shown conclusively that the Attic Greek drama is not only opera but also a ballet. Those two parts are inseparable. About the mimetic, if the Greek thinks that the music is also mimetic, so it's a very broad understanding of mimetic. It mustn't be imitational but mimetic in various senses. I think their understanding of mimetic was a little bit different from ours, and many more things are allowed, I think, to be included in this.
I think it's clear that, I mean, unfortunately, our sources on Greek dance, other than things that talk about pantomime, like Lucian and other late sources, which clearly aren't very relevant to, classical dance, I don't think. In our very limited sources, I mean, I think we already see that both Aristotle and Plutarch really are talking about something more than just mimetic in a literal sense.
And a short remark on this chiastic movement. Did you? I think that's it. Did you suggest a specific movement? Because somehow I saw it's
well, I
mean, not parallel, but something like that.
It depends. I mean, this is a big controversy I didn't want to get into, but there's in our very limited sources about formations of tragic dancers, it appears that there's several sources that describe the entrance of the chorus as if they're in formation in a series of lines. Okay, so if it was 12 in the chorus, there would be 2 lines of 6. And then if it's the 15-person chorus, there would be 3 lines with the chorus leader in the middle. That's almost certain. So probably the choral entrance was in rectangular formation. And there's been a period in the scholarship where people were arguing that that's the only way that choruses dance, that they went over this way and then they turned back this way in the strophe and antistrophe. And now I think scholarship has moved in a different direction, and there's really, I think, a lot of evidence that actually choruses did dance in a circle some of the time. Just to give you one example that never worked for this group of people, when the Furies surround Orestes in the Eumenides, and he's there clinging to the statue of Athena, which is probably in the center of the orchestra, almost certainly, because they have to be able to move around him. They're circling around him. And they talk about their circle dance in the other passage I gave you. So clearly, the Furies in that play are doing a lot of circling and dance. And there's a lot of other passages, and Eric Chapo has written a lot of great stuff on this, which suggests circular dancing too. Yeah. So in a circular dance, it would be that you would go direction this way, and then you would circle back in the other direction for the antistrophe.
And the last one, does it only concern the drama? Meaning, what about choral odes in choral poetry, in Pindar, for example?
Oh, they're definitely, I didn't give you any examples from lyric, but they're definitely lyric passages that refer to dance movements, especially ones that are supposed to be the hypochorema, which is a specific kind of dance movement that we actually know something about, where they actually talk about doing stuff with their feet and hands. So so clearly that was part of a lyric tradition, especially if the lyric were actually danced, for sure. But that's like way too big for me to get into at this stage.
Please.
Thank you very much for very informative talk. I have one remark and one question. My remark will be that it struck me how I just found some other examples. You all, of course, you know them, but it struck me how it fits. The first is Sophocles. Oedipus Tyrannos first ode, first Stasimon. At the beginning of the first strophe and antistrophe, 100 images corresponding each other. Ранее водовый конский народ род фагаподано манtra, hippoi, animal, horse, and in the antistrophe at the same place, Pythagoras Paglias, Iolas Matandra Kaite Transhate Taurus. Another animal and another hunting scene. And even more impressive, the very famous second ode, second statue of the same tragedy, and the last strophic at the beginning we have movement, but of different direction and different significance. First we have impulse movement of some anonymous intruder, et disiperopta hersen evago paravatai, dicasavo betas ude, Haimon the decibon. He doesn't respect any limits, and he intrudes sacred place. And at the antistrophe we have fierce movement of chorus, which can stop if we lose connection with our bodies. Het zit op een hit van een gazen komt van een seconde. We did about the novel and other subject places, another movement at the same places but in different direction and with a different purpose. And at the very end of the same where we have the most exemplary choral self-reference and the stroke. Today Maharali, quite by us. The name
Yes.
of Henry's book.
Yeah, that Henry saw it. Right.
The corresponding read it up here. Gods are leaving us. Go out.
Because we are running out of time.
I see. So and the question is how literally we should take movement self-references of chorus and for example, of chorus leader and how it can affect our understanding of his role. For example, at the second chorus of Oedipus Colonaeus, we have chorus leader in chorus saying that he stops Creon.
Thank you very much. I suggest we continue
Can we take a
during the intermission, please.
Well, I think what you're saying is that that we can think of a lot more examples to give, and I have. Thank you very much for your examples, and I have lots. I was just trying to give examples of the most obvious possible cases for the kind of links that might occur, and then yes, I think that there are many. I think the reason I'm on the right track is that I have a lot more examples, and you're just adding to my group. So thank you. But I can't answer the question about the course leader. I haven't gotten there yet.
Thank you very much again, Professor Foley.